The first call to 911 came at 2:17 a.m. A fractured prayer screamed into the humid New Orleans night. The voice on the line belonged to Simone Babineau, a young woman whose controlled, professional tone as a nurse had been shattered into a million pieces of raw panic. My house. There was a pop, like a balloon, but loud. I smell gas. Oh God, I smell gas. My mother, she's still inside. The dispatcher's calming words were swallowed by the static of Simone's terror. She was outside, she said, on the lawn of their old shotgun house in the Treme neighborhood, the air thick with the sweet, sickening scent of disaster. By the time the first engine from the New Orleans Fire Department screamed around the corner of North Villere Street, the prayer had become a prophecy. The windows of the Babineau house glowed with a malevolent orange light, and smoke, thick and black as Mississippi mud, billowed from the eaves, staining the pale moonlight. Firefighters spilled from the truck, a disciplined flurry of motion against a backdrop of chaos. They pulled hoses, shouted commands, and smashed the front door in, a wave of water and courage against a tide of flame. Detective Miles Miller arrived 20 minutes later, his unmarked sedan cutting through the strobing red and blue lights. At 58, with a face mapped by decades of cynicism and a retirement date circled in red on his desk calendar, Miller viewed most call-outs like this as procedural headaches. A gas leak, an old house, a tragic accident. It was a familiar, sad song in a city full of them. He stepped out of his car, the humidity instantly clinging to his cheap suit. He saw the daughter, Simone, wrapped in a paramedic's blanket, her body trembling uncontrollably as she stared at the house, her face a mask of vacant horror. A young man stood beside her, his arm awkwardly around her shoulders, his own eyes wide with shock. Miller grunted a greeting to the fire captain. "What have we got, Chief?" "Looks like a gas line in the kitchen went," the captain yelled over the hiss of the hoses. Small explosion, then flashover. "We found the victim in the kitchen. DOA. Sorry, detective." Another tragedy, another file to close. Miller was already mentally drafting the report. He walked the perimeter, his shoes crunching on shattered glass. The house was a wreck, but the fire was mostly contained now, a smoldering, steaming beast. He took a perfunctory look inside. The kitchen was a blackened hellscape of melted linoleum and charred wood. He could see the fire crew carefully working around the victim's body, which was mercifully covered. He had seen enough death for one lifetime. He didn't need to see more. It was an open and shut case, a terrible accident. He could be home before sunrise. He was about to turn and leave when a young firefighter, his face smudged with soot, called out to him. "Hey, detective, you might want to see this." Miller sighed, annoyance pinching his features, and trudged back toward the kitchen's rear entrance. The firefighter pointed with a gloved hand toward the hearth in the adjoining living room, an area that had sustained smoke and water damage but had been largely spared by the flames. Lying on the floor, about 5 feet from the fireplace, was a heavy cast-iron fire poker. In the chaotic, debris-strewn room, it was an island of strange order. It wasn't covered in soot or ash. It looked as if it had been placed there after the fire had been extinguished. Miller knelt, his old knees protesting. Under the harsh glare of a portable floodlight, he saw it, a dark reddish-brown smear near the ornate handle. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and below the smear, a single long strand of dark hair was caught in the ironwork. "Was this here when you guys came in?" Miller asked, his voice suddenly sharp, the weariness replaced by a familiar spark of suspicion. "Yeah, just like that," the firefighter confirmed. "Struck me as odd. Everything else is a mess, but this thing, it's almost clean." Miller stared at the poker. A gas leak doesn't swing a fire poker. An explosion doesn't carefully place a weapon 5 feet from the hearth. The simple, sad song he'd been hearing in his head all night had just hit a dissonant, jarring chord. He looked back toward the lawn, where Simone Babineau was still shaking, her eyes fixed on the house where her mother lay dead. The look on her face was one of profound grief. But now, as Miller stared at her, he wondered what else might be hiding behind that mask of sorrow. The night was far from over. This wasn't just a file to be closed. It was a story that had just begun, and the first chapter was written in smoke and blood. 6 months earlier, the world of Simone Babineau was one of measured rhythms and muted colors, a stark contrast to the riotous palette of New Orleans that pulsed just outside her hospital walls. Her life was a quiet cadence, dictated by the beep of heart monitors and the soft squeak of her rubber-soled shoes on sterile linoleum floors. At 25, Simone was a pediatric nurse at Tulane Medical Center, and she moved through the ward like a ghost of compassion. Her hair was always pulled back in a severe bun. Her scrubs were immaculately pressed, and her face, which held a fragile, understated beauty, was rarely adorned with more than a touch of lip balm. She found solace in order, in the predictable ebb and flow of shifts, in the precise administration of medicine that could calm a fever or ease a child's pain. Her patients, small and vulnerable, adored her. While other nurses were brisk and efficient, Simone possessed a deep well of patience. She could spend 20 minutes coaxing a toddler to take a spoonful of foul-tasting antibiotics, her voice a low, soothing murmur. She read stories to children whose parents couldn't be there, her presence a quiet anchor in their sea of fear and confusion. Her colleagues respected her diligence, but often whispered that she needed to live a little. They would try to drag her out for drinks on Bourbon Street, but Simone always had an excuse. The controlled environment of the hospital felt safe. The chaotic, exuberant world outside felt like a language she couldn't speak. Her life was a reaction, a conscious retreat from the supernova that was her mother. While her mother demanded the spotlight, Simone was content in the shadows. She found fulfillment not in applause, but in the grateful squeeze of a tiny hand or the relieved smile of a worried parent. It was a small, contained existence, but it was hers. One sweltering August afternoon, that contained existence was gently breached. A young man burst through the emergency room doors, carrying a wheezing little boy in his arms. The man's face was slick with sweat and etched with panic. "Help!" he gasped. "My little brother. He can't breathe." Simone was the first to respond, her training kicking in and pushing aside the chaos. She guided him to a cubicle, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his frantic energy. As she worked, hooking the little boy up to a nebulizer, she was aware of the older brother watching her every move. He was tall and lean, with kind eyes and a smile that seemed a little lost on his worried face. His name was Jamal Carter. He was 24, and his entire world seemed to revolve around his 7-year-old brother, Leo. "Thank you," Jamal said, his voice husky with relief as Leo's breathing began to even out. "I've never seen him have an attack that bad. I didn't know what to do." "You did the right thing by bringing him in," Simone replied, her focus still on the child. "He's going to be just fine." Jamal stayed for hours, long after Leo had fallen asleep, the plastic mask still strapped to his small face. He and Simone fell into an easy conversation. He was an aspiring chef, working grueling hours as a line cook at a Creole restaurant in the Garden District, saving every penny to one day open his own place. He spoke of food with a passion Simone usually only saw in doctors discussing a complex diagnosis. He talked about his dream of creating a modern twist on classic soul food, of honoring his grandmother's recipes while making them his own. There was a sincerity to him, a lack of the usual bravado she encountered in men. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was simply sharing his world. When his shift ended, he hesitated by the nurse's station. "I know this is forward," he began, rubbing the back of his neck, "but I'd really like to thank you properly. Maybe I could buy you a coffee sometime, or, cook you dinner." For the first time in a long time, Simone felt a flutter of something other than professional duty. She saw in Jamal a kindred spirit, someone dedicated to a craft, someone with a quiet ambition that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. She found herself saying yes. Their first few dates were tentative and sweet. They walked through Audubon Park, sharing stories under the sprawling oak trees. He took her to a tiny, hole-in-the-wall po' boy shop that he swore was the best in the city. He never pushed, never pried. He seemed to understand and appreciate her reserved nature, seeing it not as a flaw, but as a quiet strength. With him, she didn't feel the need to be louder, brighter, or more exciting. She could just be Simone. For the first time, she felt like that was enough. He was a gentle melody entering her quiet life, and she began to believe, foolishly perhaps, that their two different rhythms could harmonize into a beautiful, simple song. After 2 months of gentle courtship, the inevitable moment arrived. looming in Simone's mind like a summer storm cloud over Lake Pontchartrain. It was time for Jamal to meet her mother. She had postponed it for as long as she could, crafting excuses and changing the subject whenever he brought it up. It wasn't that she was ashamed of her mother, it was that she was terrified. Introducing someone to Nia Babineau wasn't like a normal meeting. It was an audition, and Simone knew, with a weary certainty, that it was an audition most people failed simply by being eclipsed. "Don't be so nervous," Jamal said, squeezing her hand as they walked up the jasmine-lined path to her mother's house. It was a beautifully restored Creole cottage in the French Quarter, painted a vibrant coral with dark green shutters. It was a house that demanded to be looked at. "I'm sure she's amazing. She raised you after all." Simone offered a weak smile. He had no idea. The door swung open before they could knock, as if on cue. And there was Nia. At 47, she didn't just defy age, she mocked it. She stood framed in the doorway, a vision in a flowing silk caftan that shimmered with hues of sapphire and gold. An intricate silver necklace, heavy and artisanal, rested against her collarbones, and her hair was a magnificent mane of braids woven with silver thread. A glass of white wine was held delicately in one hand. She was not a mother, she was a spectacle. Nia Babineau was a New Orleans legend. For 2 decades, her voice, a smoky, soulful blend of Billie Holiday and Nina Simone, had filled the city's most exclusive jazz clubs. She was the queen of a nocturnal kingdom, a woman who commanded every room she entered with an intoxicating mix of raw talent and unapologetic sensuality. "Simone, my quiet little bird, you finally brought him home." Nia's voice was like warm honey laced with expensive bourbon. She enveloped Simone in a brief perfumed hug that smelled of gardenias and whiskey. Then her eyes, sharp and intelligent, immediately locked onto Jamal. Simone watched it happen, the familiar, predictable sequence of events. She saw Jamal's easy smile falter for a split second, his posture straightening as he was caught in Nia's gravitational pull. It was the same reaction all men had. They were momentarily stunned, captivated by the sheer force of her presence. "And you must be Jamal," Nia said, bypassing a handshake and stepping forward to place her hands on his arms. "Simone described you as nice. Darling, that's a terrible injustice." She laughed, a deep, throaty sound that filled the air. "You're magnificent." Jamal blushed, a deep crimson spreading up his neck. "It's an honor to meet you, Ms. Babineau. I'm a huge fan of your music." "Call me Nia, sweetheart." "Ms. Babineau is for the tax man," she purred, finally releasing him and ushering them inside. The house was like Nia herself, dramatic, beautiful, and entirely centered around her. The walls were covered with framed posters of her performances, glowing reviews from music critics, and photographs of her with jazz luminaries. There was scarcely a picture of Simone to be seen. The air was thick with incense, and a low, mournful saxophone solo drifted from a hidden speaker. Dinner was less a meal and more a performance, with Nia as the star. She regaled them with stories of late-night jam sessions with famous musicians, of turning down a record deal in New York because no city has a soul like this one, of the passion and pain required to sing the blues. She directed all her questions, all her charm, all her energy at Jamal. She asked about his culinary ambitions with a focused intensity that made him feel like the most interesting man in the world. Simone sat silently, a spectator at her own life, pushing a piece of shrimp around her plate. She felt herself shrinking, her colors fading to gray in her mother's vibrant light. Jamal was utterly enchanted. He hung on Nia's every word, his eyes shining with an admiration that went beyond mere politeness. He had never been in the presence of such a woman, someone so confident, so worldly, so alive. Toward the end of the meal, Jamal, trying to include Simone, complimented the gumbo. "This is incredible, Simone. You must have learned from the best." Nia let out another one of her melodic laughs, placing a perfectly manicured hand on Jamal's arm. "Oh, darling, no," she said, her tone light but the words edged with steel. "Simone doesn't have the patience for cooking. She's good at the quiet things, the meticulous things. You need fire in your soul to make a good roux." She paused, her gaze flicking to Simone for a brief dismissive moment before returning to Jamal. "Let a real woman show you what flavor is all about sometime." The promise in her voice was unmistakable. It wasn't an invitation, It was a declaration. And in that moment, Simone felt a cold dread creep into her heart. She wasn't just being overshadowed. A line had just been drawn, and she and her mother were on opposite sides. Nia's declaration at dinner was not an empty promise. It was the opening act of a meticulously orchestrated seduction. She began to weave herself into Jamal's life under the guise of mentorship, a role she played with masterful precision. A few days after their first meeting, she called him. "Jamal, darling," her voice flowed through the phone like velvet. "I was speaking with Antoine Bisset, the owner of Le Coq Rouge. A brilliant man, but his menu is so tired. I mentioned a certain passionate young chef who wants to reinvent Creole cuisine. He was intrigued." Jamal was floored. Le Coq Rouge was one of the most acclaimed restaurants in the city. An introduction from Nia Babineau was like a key to a locked kingdom. Of course, he agreed to meet her at her club, Nia's Blue Dahlia, to discuss it. The club was Nia's throne room. Tucked away on a quiet street in the Faubourg Marigny, it was an intimate, decadent space with dark wood, plush red velvet banquettes, and walls adorned with moody black and white photographs of jazz legends. When Jamal arrived, Nia was on stage, bathed in a single smoky spotlight. She wasn't just singing, she was communing with the music. Her eyes were closed, her body swayed with an uninhibited grace, and her voice wrapped around the audience, pulling them into her world of heartbreak and longing. Jamal stood at the back, mesmerized. He had listened to her albums, but seeing her live was a different experience entirely. It was raw, powerful, and overwhelmingly sensual. She didn't just perform a song, she inhabited it. After her set, she joined him at a secluded table, the energy of the stage still clinging to her like a second skin. "You see, sweetheart," she said, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "It's all about passion, in music, in food, in life. You can't be afraid to burn." She made the introductions. She charmed Antoine Bisset, who hung on her every word. Jamal felt a heady rush of excitement and gratitude. Nia was opening doors for him that he had only dreamed of. Simone was supportive and kind, but she couldn't do this. She didn't move in these circles. She didn't possess this kind of power. He told himself he was doing it for his future, for their future. The mentorship sessions became more frequent. Nia invited him over to her house to talk strategy, which soon evolved into late-night cooking lessons. With Simone working a night shift, they would stand in Nia's large gourmet kitchen. But the lessons were less about food and more about intimacy. Nia would guide his hand as he chopped vegetables, her body pressing lightly against his. She would have him taste a sauce from her fingertip, her gaze holding his a second too long. She talked to him about his dreams, his fears, and his relationship with Simone. "She's a sweet girl," Nia would say, her voice a confidential whisper as she poured them both another glass of expensive wine. "But she's timid. She's afraid of life. A man with your kind of fire needs a woman who isn't afraid of being burned. Someone who will fan the flames, not try to put them out." Jamal was a moth drawn to a magnificent, dangerous flame. He was out of his depth, and he knew it, but he was too intoxicated by the attention, the glamour, and the raw, adult desire Nia exuded to pull away. Simone's love was a gentle, steady warmth. Nia's attention was a wildfire. The physical affair began one rainy Tuesday night. Simone was pulling a double shift at the hospital. Nia had called Jamal, saying she was feeling blue and needed company. They drank wine and listened to old records. She told him about her failed marriage to Simone's father, a man she described as weak and unable to handle a strong woman. Then she stood up, swaying slightly to the music, and pulled him to his feet. "Dance with me, Jamal," she whispered. As they moved together in the dimly lit living room, the pretense of mentorship dissolved. Her body was confident and knowing against his. She looked up at him, her eyes dark with a hunger that both terrified and thrilled him. "Simone doesn't know what she has," she murmured, her lips brushing his. "But I do." The kiss was everything Simone's weren't. It wasn't tender or hesitant. It was deep, demanding, and consuming. It was the kiss of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and wasn't afraid to take it. In that moment, Jamal's guilt was drowned out by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated lust. He had crossed a line, And as Naya led him by the hand towards her bedroom, he knew with a sickening certainty that there was no going back. He was no longer just his girlfriend's partner. He had become the Jazz Queen's secret. The change in Jamal was not a sudden storm, but a slow, creeping fog that gradually obscured the man Simone had fallen for. He became distant, his easy smile often replaced by a strained, preoccupied expression. The simple melody of their relationship began to fill with dissonant, jarring notes. Dates were canceled at the last minute, always with a plausible, work-related excuse. "Sorry, babe, Chef Bisset needs me to stay and prep for a private party." Or, "The sous chef called in sick. I have to cover his shift." Simone, ever trusting, accepted his apologies, hiding her disappointment. But the small inconsistencies began to pile up, like loose change that eventually becomes heavy in your pocket. One evening, while cleaning out his car, she found a small, elegant silver hairpin tucked into the crevice of the passenger seat. It was ornate and expensive-looking, nothing like the simple clips and ties she used. She recognized the intricate design instantly. It was from a collection of silver jewelry her mother wore religiously, claiming it connected her to the moon's energy. When she asked Jamal about it, he glanced at it and shrugged. "No idea. Must have been left by one of the waitresses I gave a ride to." The lie was clumsy, and for the first time, a seed of real suspicion took root in Simone's mind. A week later, he came home late from work, smelling faintly of wine and a familiar perfume, the heady blend of gardenia and whiskey that was her mother's signature scent. "Wow, the restaurant must have been busy," she commented, trying to keep her tone light. "You smell like you were wrestling with a cocktail list." "Yeah, something like that," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes as he headed for the shower. The fog of unease thickened into a cloud of dread. Simone started to notice how often her mother's name came up in their conversations, always framed as part of Jamal's career. "Nia thinks I should add more seafood to my concept menu. Nia introduced me to a food critic from the Times-Picayune." It was no longer Simone he shared his dreams with first. It was Nia. He spoke of her with a kind of reverence, the same way he had on the night he first met her. Simone felt a growing sense of erasure, as if her role in his life was being systematically edited out and replaced. Her quiet world, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison of doubt. At the hospital, she found it hard to concentrate. The precise, orderly tasks that once soothed her now felt meaningless. A colleague had to gently point out that she'd charted a patient's medication incorrectly, a mistake she had never made before. "You okay, Simone?" the older nurse asked, her voice full of concern. "You seem a million miles away." The breaking point came on a Saturday night. Simone had finished her shift early and wanted to surprise Jamal at the restaurant, maybe share a late dessert. He had told her he was working a double, wouldn't be home until after 2 a.m. When she arrived at Le Coq Rouge, the hostess informed her that Jamal had clocked out hours ago. A cold knot formed in Simone's stomach. She called his phone. "Hey, babe," he answered, his voice thick with sleep. "What's up? I'm in bed, totally exhausted." "Oh, okay," Simone said, her own voice sounding thin and distant to her ears. "I just got off work. I'll see you at home." She hung up, standing frozen on the street corner. His lie was so blatant, so effortless. She started walking, her feet moving without conscious thought, her mind racing. Where was he? As she passed a small upscale bar, she heard a familiar strain of music drifting through the open doorway. It was a sultry, slow-burning rendition of "I Put a Spell on You." She stopped, the melody pulling at her. She knew that arrangement, the unique way the saxophone curled around the lyrics. It was from her mother's new live album, the one she had just released. And the club was broadcasting the performance live on the local jazz radio station every Saturday night. Her mother was on stage, right now, less than a mile away, and Jamal, who was supposed to be exhausted in bed, was almost certainly somewhere in that smoky, crowded room, listening to her sing. The fog had finally cleared, revealing a landscape of betrayal that was stark and terrifyingly clear. The walk to her mother's house was a blur. The vibrant, noisy streets of the French Quarter, usually a source of anxiety for Simone, were now just a meaningless backdrop to the storm raging inside her. The jazz music spilling from every bar, the laughter of tourists, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, it all faded into a dull roar in her ears. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate beat. She wasn't sure what she was going to do. what she was going to say. She only knew that she couldn't live another second in the suffocating fog of uncertainty. She used her own key, letting herself into the coral-colored cottage as quietly as a shadow. The house was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the scent of burnt-out incense and wine. From the back of the house, from her mother's bedroom, she could hear the low murmur of voices and the soft strains of a saxophone from the stereo. She crept down the hallway, her sneakers making no sound on the polished hardwood floors. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. For a moment she hesitated, her hand hovering over the cool brass knob. A part of her, the small, frightened part that had always sought peace and quiet, screamed at her to turn around, to go back to her own apartment, to pretend she hadn't come, hadn't heard. But the part of her that had been wounded, lied to, and dismissed for months, for years, for her entire life, that part pushed her forward. She peered through the crack. The scene inside was bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. And it was worse than anything she could have imagined. Her mother, Nia, was lying back against a mountain of silk pillows, wearing nothing but an unfastened robe. And Jamal, her Jamal, was kneeling on the bed beside her, kissing her. It wasn't a stolen, illicit peck. It was a long, slow, intimate kiss, the kind shared between lovers who believe they are safe and alone. A sound, a choked gasp, escaped Simone's lips. She hadn't meant to make it, but it was enough. Inside the room, Jamal's head snapped up. His eyes met Simone's through the crack in the door, and in them, she saw a flicker of panic, then a wave of pure, unadulterated horror. He scrambled off the bed, pulling away from Nia as if he'd been burned. Nia, however, showed no such alarm. She simply sat up, pulling her robe closed with a languid, unhurried movement. There was no shame in her eyes, no guilt, only a flicker of annoyance, as if Simone had interrupted a particularly enjoyable part of a performance. Simone pushed the door open. It swung inward with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. She stood in the doorway, her body trembling, her mind a screaming void. The three of them were frozen in a horrific tableau: the betrayed girlfriend, the guilty lover, and the triumphant queen. "Simone," Jamal stammered, fumbling to pull on his discarded shirt. It's not what it looks like." The cliché was so absurd, so insulting, that it broke Simone's paralysis. A laugh, harsh and brittle, escaped her. "Not what it looks like?" she repeated, her voice shaking with a rage she didn't know she possessed. "It looks like my boyfriend is in my mother's bed. Tell me, Jamal, what part of that am I getting wrong?" "Darling, don't be so dramatic," Nia said, her voice dripping with condescension. She swung her legs off the bed and stood up, the silk of her robe whispering against her skin. "We're all adults here. These things happen." These things happen?" Simone took a step into the room, her gaze fixed on her mother. "You are my mother. He is my boyfriend. This is not just one of those things." "Listen to me, Simone. It got complicated," Jamal pleaded, his eyes darting between the two women. But Nia cut him off. She walked towards Simone, her expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "Complicated? No, sweetheart. It's actually very simple. He's a man with a fire in his belly, and he was with a girl who is afraid of heat." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, each one a deliberate, calculated strike. She was enjoying this, Simone realized with a sickening lurch. This was her final, greatest performance. "You knew," Simone whispered, the words barely audible. "You knew how much he meant to me." Nia tilted her head, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Of course I knew, but you have to know how to hold on to a man, my quiet little bird. It's a lesson you never learned." She took another step closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. And then she delivered the final, fatal blow. "Do you want to know what he said about you, Simone? He told me that being with you was like taking care of one of his patients. Gentle, careful, and utterly soul-crushingly boring." She looked past Simone to Jamal. "But with me, he said he finally felt alive." Nia's words struck Simone not like a slap, but like a physical blow to the chest, knocking the air from her lungs and leaving a ringing silence in her ears. Soul-crushingly boring. The phrase echoed in the void, a final damning verdict on her entire existence. Everything she was, her quiet nature, her careful demeanor, her gentle love, was being twisted into a pathetic weakness and thrown back in her face. In that moment, something inside her, something that had been coiled tight for 25 years, finally snapped. The world narrowed to a tunnel, with her mother's smug, triumphant face at the far end. The rage was a white-hot, silent inferno, burning away all thought, all reason, all fear. She saw the living room through the bedroom door, the flicker of the gas fireplace her mother had insisted on installing for ambiance. And next to it, resting in its wrought iron stand, was the heavy cast iron fire poker. She moved without conscious thought. Her body, usually so controlled and deliberate, was now an instrument of pure, primal fury. She lunged past her mother, her hand closing around the cool, heavy metal of the poker's handle. "Simone, what are you doing?" Jamal cried out, taking a step toward her. Nia just laughed, a sound of pure, arrogant disbelief. "Oh, please. What are you going to do? Poke me with that thing?" Simone turned, the poker held tight in her grip. She saw not her mother, but a lifetime of slights, of being overshadowed, of being made to feel small and inadequate. She saw the woman who had stolen every boyfriend, every moment of attention, and now, the one man she thought she could trust. She swung. The poker connected with the side of Nia's head with a sickening, wet thud. The sound was shocking, final. Nia's eyes widened in stunned surprise, her cruel smile frozen on her face. A dark line of blood instantly bloomed in her silver-threaded hair. She staggered back, her hand flying to her head, a look of confusion replacing the arrogance. But Simone wasn't finished. The first blow had broken a dam, and now a lifetime of repressed anger came flooding out. She swung again and again, her movements frantic and clumsy, fueled by a bottomless well of pain and rage. Jamal shouted her name, grabbing at her arms, but it was like trying to stop a hurricane. She was beyond hearing, beyond reason. Finally, Jamal managed to wrench the poker from her grasp, throwing it across the room where it clattered against the far wall. Simone stumbled back, her chest heaving, the red mist of fury slowly beginning to recede. She looked down. Nia had collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug, her limbs tangled at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. A dark, viscous pool was spreading rapidly from beneath her head, staining the intricate patterns of the carpet. The room was utterly silent, save for the sound of Simone's own ragged breathing and the soft, mocking jazz still playing from the stereo. Reality crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. "Oh, God," she whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh, my God." Jamal stood frozen for a long moment, his face ashen, his eyes wide with horror. Then he knelt beside Nia, his hands hovering over her, unsure of what to do. "Nia?" he whispered. He touched her neck, searching for a pulse. He found nothing. She's gone, Simone. Oh, Christ, she's dead." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Simone's shock. She looked at her mother's body, at Jamal's terrified face, at her own hands, which felt alien and monstrous. Prison. Police. A lifetime locked away. The thought was unbearable. "No," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "No, no, no." Her mind, the same mind that could calmly assess a medical emergency, was now racing, searching for a way out of an impossible situation. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the gas fireplace. An idea, desperate and insane, began to form. "The gas," she said, her voice gaining a frantic urgency. "Jamal, we have to... the gas." "What are you talking about?" he stammered, staring at her as if she'd lost her mind. "An accident," she explained, the words tumbling out. "A gas leak, an explosion, the fire. The fire will destroy everything, the evidence, everything." She was already moving toward the kitchen, her nurse's mind now focused on a new, horrific procedure. Jamal stared from her to Nia's body. He was paralyzed by fear and guilt. He had helped create this monster, this moment of ultimate violence. His affair, his weakness, had led to this. "Simone, this is crazy. We have to call the police." "And say what?" she shrieked, whirling on him. "That I murdered my own mother? They will lock me away forever. Is that what you want?" She grabbed his arms, her grip surprisingly strong. "You were part of this, Jamal. You were in her bed. They will drag you down with me. Help me. Please, help me, and we can walk away from this. We can say it was a terrible accident." He looked at the dead woman on the floor, the woman who had seduced and promised him the world. He looked at Simone, the woman he had loved and betrayed, her face now a terrifying mask of desperation. He had already destroyed her life with his infidelity. Now, caught in a trap of his own making, he made a fatal choice. He nodded, a slow, sickening surrender. Their shared secret, once born of illicit passion, was now sealed in blood and fire. For 3 days, the official narrative held firm. The tragic death of Nia Babineau was an accident. The preliminary report from the fire marshal cited a faulty gas coupling on the kitchen stove, a common problem in the city's older homes. The press ran glowing eulogies for the fallen jazz legend, painting a picture of a vibrant life cut short by a cruel twist of fate. Detective Miller, satisfied with a swift and simple conclusion, was ready to stamp the file, closed, and move on. He had offered his condolences to the grieving daughter and her boyfriend, noting their believable shock and sorrow, and felt his job was done. But Detective Maria Hayes, his partner of 2 years, couldn't shake a feeling of profound unease. Hayes was everything Miller was not: young, sharp, fiercely ambitious, and a black woman who had fought tooth and nail to earn her detective's shield in the notoriously old boy network of the NOPD. Where Miller saw a straightforward accident, Hayes saw a story with too many loose threads. She sat across from him in their cramped office, the Nia Babineau file open on her desk. "Miles, this doesn't feel right," she said, tapping a pen on the preliminary coroner's report. Miller sighed, not looking up from his crossword puzzle. "What's not to feel right about, Maria? Old house, bad gas line, boom. It's a sad story, but it's not a complicated one. Happens all the time." "The body," Hayes pressed on, ignoring his dismissiveness. "The fire captain said they found her in the middle of the kitchen floor, away from the stove. If there was a gas leak at the stove that exploded, the blast would have thrown her away from it, not left her 10 feet away, lying almost peacefully. Maybe she smelled the gas, was running out, and got caught in the flashover," Miller countered, filling in a 4-letter word for omen. "Maybe," Hayes conceded. "But look at the daughter's statement." She slid a copy across the desk. "Simone Babineau said she was in her upstairs bedroom when she heard a pop and then smelled gas. She ran downstairs, saw the kitchen was on fire, and ran out the front door. The boyfriend, Jamal Carter, says he was on the porch the whole time, waiting for her. He heard the pop and saw her run out." "Okay, and?" Miller asked, his patience wearing thin. "And their stories are a little too perfect, a little too neat," Hayes said, her voice intense. "They match up perfectly, almost like they were rehearsed. And there's this," she pointed to a line in the fire report. "They found the back door unlocked and slightly ajar. If you smell gas and see a fire, do you run out the front door when the back door is right there in the kitchen, offering a closer escape?" Miller finally put down his newspaper and looked at her, a hint of patronizing amusement in his eyes. "Hayes, you're seeing ghosts. The kid was in a panic. She wasn't thinking about the most efficient exit route. She was thinking about getting the hell out. And for God's sake, her mother just died. Give her a break." He leaned back in his chair, his tone shifting. "Look, I get it. You're new, you want to make your mark. But you can't turn every tragedy in the Treme into a federal case. These are good people going through hell. Let's just let them grieve." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. These people. To Miller, it was just another unfortunate incident in a predominantly black neighborhood. Tragic, but unremarkable. To Hayes, who had grown up not far from there, his easy dismissal felt like a quiet form of prejudice, an unwillingness to look deeper because the victims weren't from a wealthier, whiter part of town. "With all due respect, Miles, I think we're letting them grieve too easily," she said, her voice firm. "The preliminary ME report lists smoke inhalation as the cause of death, but it also notes blunt force trauma to the head, listed as secondary and likely caused by falling debris from the explosion." Hayes leaned forward, her eyes locking on his. "I want a full, detailed autopsy. I want the ME to look at that head wound very, very closely. I want to know if that injury happened before or after the fire started." Miller stared at her, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. A full autopsy would mean more paperwork, more man-hours, more headaches for a case he considered closed. But he also saw the unyielding determination in her eyes. He knew she wouldn't let it go. "Fine," he grumbled, waving a dismissive hand. "Waste the city's money, order the full report, but when it comes back saying exactly what we already know, the next round of beignets is on you." Hayes nodded, a tight, humorless smile on her lips. "Deal." As she picked up the phone to call the coroner's office, she felt a grim certainty settle over her. She didn't know what had happened in that house, but she knew it wasn't an accident. The perfect story Simone and Jamal had told was beginning to crack, and she was determined to find out what truths lay beneath the surface. The real autopsy results arrived on her desk 2 days later. She read the single, highlighted sentence, and a chill ran down her spine. The report confirmed a massive depressed skull fracture on the right parietal bone of the victim. The analysis of tissue from the wound showed no evidence of soot or carbon monoxide saturation, while the lungs were full of it. The conclusion was unequivocal and terrifying. Ania Babineau had been struck on the head with tremendous force before the fire ever began. She was likely already dead, or at least dying, when she breathed in the smoke. Hayes stood up and walked over to Miller's desk, dropping the report in the middle of his crossword puzzle. "Miles," she said, her voice cold and steady. "It's a homicide, and our 2 grieving witnesses just became our 2 prime suspects." The shift from accident to homicide investigation descended on the case like a shroud. The Babineau house, once a scene of tragedy, was now a full-blown crime scene. Yellow tape, which had been taken down, went back up, stark and accusatory against the building's charred facade. Detective Miller, his face a grim mask of begrudging acceptance, had to admit Hayes had been right. The easy file had just become a nightmare. "All right, so they lied," Miller said, standing with Hayes across the street from the house. "They hit her on the head and then set the fire to cover it up. But with what? The ME said the weapon was heavy, blunt, with a unique shape. The forensics team swept the place twice. There's nothing there. The fire and the water damage destroyed any trace evidence." Hayes stared at the house, her mind working through the puzzle. They wouldn't have taken the weapon with them. Too risky. It has to be in there, or it was something that belonged there, something that wouldn't look out of place. She thought back to the initial reports, the chaotic first hours of the incident. "Something is bothering me about the fire itself. The accelerant report came back negative. If they started it, how? Faulty gas line, remember?" Miller grunted. "Maybe they just loosened it, let the gas build up, and sparked it with something." "It's possible," Hayes said, though her gut told her it was too clean, too convenient. But if they were smart enough to stage a gas explosion, they were smart enough to hide a murder weapon. We're missing something. She turned to Miller, an idea forming. "Let's get the K9 unit back out here." Miller rolled his eyes. "For what? To sniff for a ghost? The place has been hosed down with thousands of gallons of water, Maria. Any scent is long gone." "Not for an accelerant dog," Hayes insisted. "They're trained to detect residue, even after a fire. If they use something to kickstart that blaze, the dog might find it. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we have right now." Grumbling about overtime and pointless procedures, Miller made the call. The next morning, Officer Russo arrived with his partner, Shadow, a sleek black Labrador with an intense, focused gaze. Shadow was one of the department's best arson dogs, able to detect minute traces of dozens of different chemical accelerants. Hayes briefed Russo, who listened intently before giving Shadow the command to seek. The dog moved through the ruined house with a quiet, methodical purpose that was almost unnerving. He sniffed methodically along the baseboards, around the charred remains of furniture, through the blackened kitchen where Nia's body had been found. For nearly an hour, there was nothing. Shadow remained silent, his tail low. Miller stood with his arms crossed, a smug, "I told you so" expression on his face. Then Shadow's behavior changed. He was in the living room, near the large brick fireplace. He started sniffing intently at a section of the floor several feet away from the hearth, an area that had been damaged by water, but not directly burned. His tail began to wag stiffly, and he let out a low woof. He pawed at a specific floorboard, then looked back at Russo, whining with excitement. "He's got something," Russo announced, his voice sharp. Miller and Hayes crowded around. "Right there?" Miller asked, incredulous. There's no fire damage here. The explosion was in the kitchen. The dog doesn't lie, Detective, Russo said. He pulled on a pair of gloves and, using a pry bar from his kit, carefully lifted the floorboard Shadow had indicated. Underneath, nestled in the dark, dusty space of the subfloor, was a small blackened bundle of cloth. It was a rag, stiff and charred at the edges. Russo carefully placed it in an evidence bag. Even before it was sealed, Hayes could smell the faint, unmistakable odor of gasoline. The discovery sent a jolt of energy through the investigation. They hadn't just turned up the gas, they had used an accelerant. It was premeditated, it was deliberate, and the location was crucial. The killer had likely tossed the lit rag from the living room into the gas-filled kitchen, then fled. As the forensics team documented the new evidence, Hayes' eyes scanned the living room again, her mind replaying the scenario. The killer stands here, throws the rag, then what? Her gaze fell upon the fireplace. Next to it was an empty wrought iron stand. The fire tools, she said, almost to herself. The first responders' photos showed a set of fireplace tools here. A brush, a shovel, a set of tongs, and a poker. She pulled up a crime scene photo on her phone from the night of the fire. The set was there, intact. Where are they now? Miller made a quick call. The tools had been bagged as standard evidence but deemed unremarkable and were sitting in the evidence locker. Get them sent to the lab, Hayes ordered. Have them check every inch of that set, especially the poker. Compare any trace evidence to the victim. Later that afternoon, the call came from the forensics lab. The poker was clean, wiped down with some kind of solvent. But under microscopic analysis, deep within the intricate scrollwork of the cast iron handle, they had found it. A single strand of hair, too small to be seen by the naked eye. It had been protected from the cleaning agent and the fire, and wedged even deeper into a crevice was a microscopic speck of tissue. Lab ran a rapid DNA analysis. The tissue was a match for Nia Babineau. The hair, caught in the handle, belonged to her daughter, Simone. Hayes hung up the phone, a cold sense of victory settling over her. Shadow hadn't just found the accelerant. He had led them right back to the weapon. It hadn't been hidden at all. It had been cleaned and put back in plain sight, a silent, arrogant witness to a crime they thought they had burned away. The perfect story had not just cracked, it had been blown wide open. With the forensic evidence as their hammer, Detectives Hayes and Miller brought Simone Babineau and Jamal Carter in for questioning. They were placed in separate interrogation rooms, the classic strategy designed to break an alliance. The time for gentle questions and sympathetic nods was over. Miller took Jamal. He walked into the small, windowless room and dropped the file containing the lab reports onto the metal table with a loud thud that made Jamal flinch. Miller, a man who believed in the direct approach, decided to go straight for the jugular. "The game is up, son," Miller began, his voice low and gravelly. He leaned forward, his large frame seeming to suck the air out of the room. "We know it wasn't a gas leak. We found the rag soaked in gasoline you used to start the fire. We found the fire poker you used to bash her head in. We have Simone's hair on the handle and Nia's blood on it. We have you for murder and arson." It was a barrage of partial truths and outright bluffs. They didn't know for sure who had swung the poker, but the effect on Jamal was immediate. The color drained from his face. He started to tremble, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but his eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "Don't you," Miller sneered, circling the table like a shark. "Let me paint a picture for you, Jamal. You're a talented young chef. You've got a future. But right now, that future looks like 25 to life in Angola prison. You think you can handle that? You think they'll appreciate your fancy Creole cooking in the prison mess hall?" He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Your girlfriend, Simone, she's in the next room, and my partner is offering her a deal. She's telling her that you're the one who lost his temper, that you were sleeping with her mother, things got out of hand, and you snapped. She's telling her that if she testifies against you, she might walk away with a lesser charge, manslaughter maybe, while you rot for the rest of your life." Jamal's head snapped up, his eyes wide with betrayal and fear. "No, she wouldn't do that." "Wouldn't she?" Miller shrugged. "You lied to her. You cheated on her with her own mother. Why in God's name would she protect you now? It's you or her, son, and right now, she's choosing her." Meanwhile, in the adjacent room, Detective Hayes was taking a completely different approach with Simone. She entered quietly, placing a cup of water on the table in front of the young woman. Simone sat ramrod straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the picture of a calm, grieving daughter. But Hayes could see the frantic pulse beating in her neck. "Simone," Hayes began, her voice soft and understanding, "I can only imagine what you've been through. Losing your mother in such a horrific way. It's unthinkable." Simone just nodded, her eyes fixed on the table. "It was a terrible accident." Hayes let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before continuing. "We know about you and Jamal, and we know about Jamal and your mother." Simone's head jerked up, her composure finally cracking. A flicker of pain and anger crossed her face before she could mask it again. "It must have been so hard," Hayes continued, her tone empathetic. "Living in her shadow, always feeling like you weren't enough. She was a powerful personality. I've read the articles. A woman like that can take up all the oxygen in a room. And then for her to do that to you, with the one person you trusted. I can't imagine the pain, the betrayal." Tears began to well in Simone's eyes. Hayes was giving voice to every secret, painful thought she had harbored for years. "Jamal is in the next room, Simone," Hayes said gently. "And he's scared. He's a weak man. You know that now. And weak men, when they're cornered, they do whatever it takes to save themselves. He's starting to build a story where you were the one who was jealous and unstable, a story where he was just a victim of two powerful women." Simone shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "No, he is," Hayes said, her voice firm but still kind. "But I don't believe that's the whole truth. I look at you and I don't see a cold-blooded killer. I see a daughter who was pushed too far. I see a good person who was driven to a terrible act by unimaginable pain. The law makes a distinction between premeditated murder and a crime of passion. But for that to matter, I need to hear the truth from you. What really happened in that house, Simone?" Back in Miller's interrogation room, Jamal was unraveling. The vision of Simone betraying him, of spending his life in prison, was too much. "It wasn't me," he suddenly blurted out, his voice cracking. "I didn't hit her. I would never." Miller stopped pacing. "Then who did?" Tears streamed down Jamal's face as the whole sordid story came pouring out. The affair, the confrontation, Nia's cruel taunts, and Simone's final violent snap. He described the frantic moments afterward, Simone's desperate plan to cover it up, and how he, paralyzed by fear and guilt, had helped her. "I tried to stop her," he sobbed, his head in his hands. She wasn't herself. It was like something broke inside her. I never should have let it happen. I'm so sorry." His confession was a dam breaking, a torrent of guilt and self-preservation that washed away the last of his loyalty. He gave them everything, the sequence of events, the lighting of the rag, the cleaning of the fire poker. He confessed his own role in the cover-up, hoping for leniency, hoping to save some small piece of his future from the wreckage. When Hayes was informed, she returned to Simone's room. She sat down, her expression somber. "Simone," she said softly, "Jamal told us everything." Simone looked up, her face streaked with tears. The fight went out of her. There were no more lies to tell, no more secrets to keep. In a voice barely above a whisper, choked with a grief that was both for her mother and for herself, she began to speak, and she confirmed every last detail of the story her lover had just used to save himself. The trial of Simone Babineau became the quiet tragedy that followed the loud, sensational headlines. In the sterile, wood-paneled courtroom, the vibrant, chaotic world of New Orleans jazz and Creole cooking was reduced to a series of police reports, forensic evidence, and tearful testimonies. The city, which had first mourned the loss of a legend, was now captivated by the story of her downfall. A tawdry tale of a mother, a daughter, and a lover caught in a fatal triangle. Jamal Carter, in exchange for his full confession and testimony against Simone, was offered a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. His dreams of owning his own restaurant were extinguished, replaced by a 5-year prison sentence. In court, he looked like a ghost, a pale imitation of the ambitious young man Simone had met in the hospital. He avoided her gaze throughout the proceedings, his shame a palpable presence in the room. Simone's trial was more complex. Her defense attorney painted a powerful picture of a young woman suffering from a lifetime of psychological abuse at the hands of a narcissistic and domineering mother. They called it cumulative provocation, a slow burn of emotional torment that finally exploded into a single, tragic act of violence. Simone took the stand, her voice small and steady as she recounted years of being belittled, overshadowed, and made to feel inadequate. She spoke of the ultimate betrayal, not with rage, but with a profound, bone-deep sadness. The prosecution, however, presented the forensic evidence: the cleaned fire poker, the gasoline-soaked rag, the elaborate cover-up. These were not the actions of someone who had simply snapped, they argued. They were the calculated steps of a killer trying to get away with murder. In the end, the jury was swayed by the human element of the tragedy. They found Simone Babineau not guilty of first-degree murder, but guilty of the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. She had acted not with premeditation, but in a sudden heat of passion, provoked beyond the limits of her endurance. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women. On the day of the sentencing, Detective Maria Hayes stood on the courthouse steps, watching as a handcuffed Simone was led to a transport van. Simone looked small and fragile, a quiet bird in a cage, almost disappearing in her oversized prison jumpsuit. There was no triumph for Hayes, only a deep, lingering sorrow. She had done her job. She had found the truth. But the truth was just another name for a ruinous, heartbreaking story. Her partner, Detective Miller, came to stand beside her, shaking his head. "Crazy damn business," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "All that over a man." Hayes looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It was never about him, Miles," she said quietly. "He was just the spark. The kindling had been drying out for 25 years. Miller looked at her, a flicker of understanding, or maybe just weariness in his old eyes. He clapped her on the shoulder. "You did good work, Hayes. Real good work." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As the transport van pulled away from the curb, carrying Simone toward her future, Hayes thought about the chain of events. It began not with a fire poker, but with a word. A series of cruel, dismissive words that had accumulated over a lifetime, each one a small cut, until the final insult caused a fatal wound. Nia Babineau, a woman who had built a career on her powerful voice, had been ultimately destroyed by her own words. Her final performance had been to taunt her daughter into a rage that consumed them all. The case left its mark on Hayes, a reminder that the most dangerous weapons are not always made of iron or steel. Sometimes they are forged from resentment, jealousy, and the silent, corrosive power of a love that was never truly given. The lesson was as old and as mournful as the blues songs Naya used to sing. Betrayal can make a killer out of a saint, and a heart, once broken in the right way, can set the whole world on fire, leaving nothing behind but the bitter taste of ash and regret.